tools and resources will be needed to begin and sustain our research project. Equally important, what incremental actions might Riversiders take while on this journey? As some of you might remember, RAR is part 2 of our initial 3-week reparations, repentance, and reconciliation speaker series that Eugene Molino helped design in June of 2021. During that series, Jermaine Ross Alam, PhD candidate at Union Theological Seminary, powerfully contoured biblical, theological, historical, and political context for us to ponder. Our pondering expanded into this series. We ask, or I'll share with you who are our speakers. Our speakers represent our clergy, staff, and friends from our local seminaries. Each has been asked to provide resources and tools from their respective fields of study, work, and leadership that would help inform and sustain our upcoming research. Here are a few teasers for the upcoming FOSDEC and the roundtable sessions. Professor Gary Dorian of Union Seminary will introduce us to the life of Harry Emerson Fosdick, the man, pastor, theologian, visionary, writer, conflict manager, and possible friend of John D. Rockefeller. Fosdick is known for his famous and persuasive sermon, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? The word tolerance seems to function as the glue that held his theological argument together. We ask, how receptive was Riverside to race diversity and inclusion? Is there evidence that Fosdick used the word tolerance to address racial changes in church membership and hiring practices and in the community? We might ask our seminary leaders, what is the role of theological education, degree, and certificate in the shaping of the broad discourse on social justice activism, advocacy, truth-telling, and strategic engagement? How might Riverside Church forge more meaningful relations with these institutions as we engage in shared ministries? Can we imagine a pipeline of learning between our institutions and Harlem churches that address ministries of repair, that is healing? So come with your questions, your observations, and your hearts as we begin this exciting journey together. I now turn it over to Carol.
Good day, everybody. I'm Carol Falcon-Pollo, and together with Dr. Pam Davis and Ruben Martinez, we co-convene Riverside's Anti-Racism Task Force, which is a standing committee of the Mission and Social Justice Commission. And we are so very pleased to collaborate with the Ministry of Faith Formation on this lecture series. It's not the first such collaboration. Many of you will recall the Race to Action series, the study of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. Anti-racism work is not siloed at Riverside, and it should not be. We're stronger together in our work for racial justice and equity. We're learning and taking action together. Accordingly, we've built numerous opportunities for your feedback into this series. One of those opportunities is going on right now, where we ask you to enter in the chat your hopes for the Remember and Repair series. So keep up your feedback or pre-feedback that you're doing right now. We're also using volunteers from Church Council and the 4 program commissions to serve as reflectors at each session to help build the final session in the series where we look together at what's next. For the end of this session, we'll ask you to jot in the chat a key takeaway or two, especially focusing on what must Riverside remember and what is ours to repair. So please be thinking about that in the course of the presentation and the discussion period that will follow. Now it's my pleasure to present the Reverend Michael Livingston, who's leading today's session. He joined Riverside as executive minister in 2014 and now serves as Riverside's interim senior minister. Before joining Riverside, he worked with Interfaith Worker Justice in Washington, D.C., advocating for underpaid workers. Previously, he gave executive leadership to the International Council of Community Churches and the National Council of Churches, where he served as the president from 2006 to 2007. Also spent 14 years as a campus pastor at Princeton Theological Seminary and began his formal ministry as a pastor in Los Angeles. Reverend Livingston believes that congregations and people of faith can make a difference as incubators for a radical love that grows strong, seeking peace through justice. Thank you, Reverend Livingston, for leading us today. Now we put the spotlight on you. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome, and I'm very glad to be here. Although I think this is the second time Martha has been the point person, though I don't think she may be the only one asking for me to participate in one of these series, and I enjoyed the last one, and I expect I will this one too. It's a lot of work, and what I'm getting at here is I may begin to avoid Martha and Carol when I see them coming my way. But you all know how much I love history, and so you'll hear a lot of that in what I'm going to do, and I think I'll just jump right in. I will be patient. I'll get to Riverside at the end, but I think we'll probably hear an awful lot more about Riverside and some of our history from Gary Dorian and the session with archives as well. So here we go. Remember and repair. If you love a country that does not, was conceived not to want you, I want to remind you, we live. We live. That's from a new volume of poetry called Found Poem by Tracy K. Smith, Poet Laureate of the United States twice, who just last year left Princeton University to join Harvard's Faculty of Literature and African American Studies. The enormous truth at the center of this poem of 17 words, several of them repeated more than once, is where I want to start this series, Remember and Repair. I want to begin with the affirmation. The first thing we have to remember as a nation is this: the indigenous peoples of this land and the Africans, stolen at sea from a Portuguese ship in 1619 by British merchants and brought to the shore of what would become Virginia. These two peoples were human beings created in the image of God. That God-given reality has never been fully realized in our national life. White supremacy and its first cousin, white privilege, operated then, operated throughout our nation's history, operate now to deprive full recognition of the common humanity we all share, the full lives we all ought to be entitled to live. The nation was not conceived wanting us, was not conceived to recognize we live, and so to honor, to value our lives. Throughout history, indigenous people have been engines, red men, bloodthirsty savages, their women squaws. African Americans have been boy, girl, pickaninny, mammy, darky, colored, niggers. Both peoples regarded as savage, subhuman things to be exploited. Indigenous children were taken, stolen from their families often, and sent to boarding schools to civilize them, to replace their native languages with English and rid them of their preferred dress in favor of Western clothing. Ultimately, they were victims of genocide, hounded, terrorized, their land stolen, the remaining few driven onto unfamiliar and unwelcoming territory and left to survive with meager resources. The African enslaved did not merit converting. Genocide would have deprived the ruling class of workers to build their wealth and ultimately the nation. Thursday night, I participated in the Zoom event, Writing Poetry and Justice, and was introduced to the poet Nikki Finney, an Afro-Latin poet. You can figure that out just listening to it, Afro-Latin. I followed up by reading about her and watched her acceptance speech of the 2011 National Book Award for Poetry. The presenter, the actor John Lithgow, afterwards called it the best acceptance speech I've ever heard for anything. Nikki Finney closed by thanking Dr. Katie Cannon, the first African-American woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA. You know, that's my denomination. And a pioneering womanist theologian who died in August of 2018. Katie and I were in the same seminary graduating class, though different institutions, though I had the great privilege and honor of knowing her well. Ms. Finney said of, and perhaps to, Katie, she was alive at the time, "What I heard you say once haunts every poem that I write. Black people were the only people in the United States ever explicitly forbidden to become literate." And she closed her speech by saying, "I am now officially speechless." We know the truth of this. For one example of many throughout the southern states, the slave codes of South Carolina in 1739 imposed a fine of $100 and 6 months in prison for anyone teaching an enslaved person to read or write. They were, "We still are not worthy of literacy, of quality public schools. Why else don't we have them? We live. We live. We are human beings, but not in the eyes, the hearts and minds, the governing structures throughout the history of our lives, of this nation. We were not human beings to the founding fathers of the nation. Enslaved Africans and born in the colonies, children of the enslaved, were simply not regarded as fully human. They were property. They could be mortgaged, traded, bought, sold, used as collateral, given as a gift, disposed of violently. This from the opening essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 Project, now made into a book from the original New York Times Magazine of 2019. Dr. Jones in the project makes the case for 1619 as the origin story of our nation, rather than, at least prior to, 1776. The 1619 Project has stricken fear into the white power structure and the vast red politically populace, anchored in the South and Midwest, but present West, South, North, and East, that clings desperately to the perverted notion that America is a white Christian nation. On MLK Day, Junior Day in 2021, 1 year ago, still President Donald Trump released the report of the 1776 Commission he created by executive order in September of 2020. They worked a few scant months, and the commission was absolutely absent of trained historians and scholars of our nation's history. The report, and I'm quoting Hannah Jones here from the 1619 Project. The report put forth a patriotic narrative that downplays racism and inequality and emphasizes a unity predicated on seeing slavery, segregation, and ongoing racial injustice as aberrations in a fundamentally just and exceptionally free nation. Well, if you believe that, you think the election was stolen and Trump should still be president. You think that January 6th, a year ago, was a gathering of freedom-loving Americans visiting the Capitol for a holiday. But we know better. They went there to overthrow the government, to keep in power the hero of their dreams, the savior of America from urban elites, socialists, from progressive forces intent upon expanding democracy and affirming the right of every American to benefit from the fruit of democracy. They were there to halt the movement of the country toward the center left, toward the celebration of diversity, toward the welcoming embrace of people of color, the right of women to own their own bodies, the possibility that immigrants might be welcomed into a nation of immigrants. They went there to thwart acceptance of the expanding reality of the fluidity of gender beyond the binary of male and female. They were there not just to protect the new conservative majority on the Supreme Court, but to build an impregnable majority for decades to come. They were there to take voting rights away from citizens unlike them, from northern and western cities and states, Black men and women whose franchise has never been a given, safe from the clutches of white men with hoods or badges or business suits. They were there to make America great again, to keep it white. We're in a struggle for the soul of the nation. Deeper still, the struggle is also for the structures and systems that govern all our lives. And our soul and these systems are not much changed from our origin. 1619, 1776. Yet we must remember we live. We live. So let me just stop and check. I just want to make sure you're hearing me. I'm coming through. We're all okay. Great. I'll go on. So I've begun this with the need for remembering our beginning, 1619. We are human. Black lives matter. Now I want to move on to 4 more issues of remembrance. I'll say what they are now and then take each one in turn. We must remember that slavery was not just about free labor and inhumanity, my first point. We must remember that this peculiar institution is foundational to the economic system of the nation, to the avaricious capitalism we practice here in the United States that is nearly unprecedented among the nations of the world. Number 3, we must remember that the Civil War is over and the South lost. Number 4, we must remember that the movement for civil rights has not been won. And then number 5, we must remember that the issue of reparations cannot be avoided if we are to be made whole. To continue then, one by one. Our uber capitalism was born and nurtured in slavery. When we tell the story of slavery, we talk about one long, dark chapter in which enslaved people are stolen from Africa, endure the Middle Passage. Those who survived are terrorized on plantations. their labor forced, women violated, families separated, men, women, and children sold. We learn about the Underground Railroad and celebrate the thirst for freedom that drove remarkable people to extraordinary feats. Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. We learn about slave revolts and the fear they struck in the white population who enslaved them. The story is not pretty, so most of us got this pared down narrative and not much more. Educated in the 50s and the 60s, that's about all I learned, if that. It was 25 decades of enslavement into one chapter, writes Edward Baptist in The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. We think it's primarily about the South, and especially the old South. The bad actors are slave traders and slave catchers, cruel overseers, and the occasional cruel master, exceptions, rather than the rule in the whole enterprise. The terrible history leads to the Civil War. The North wins, the nation is reunited, and we move on collectively, becoming finally more or less the country envisioned in the Declaration of Independence. The nation freed from the tyranny of colonialism. The half we aren't told is this enterprise created modern capitalism in the United States and beyond. Edward Baptist writes, enslaved African Americans built the modern United States, and indeed the entire modern world. Stretching out beyond the slave South, the story encompassed not only Washington politicians and voters across the United States, but also Connecticut factories, London banks, opium addicts in China, and consumers in East Africa. In the span of a single lifetime, after the 1780s, the South grew from a narrow coastal strip of worn-out plantations to a subcontinental empire, in the span of one lifetime. Dr. Baptist continues, by the 1840s, the United States had grown into both an empire and a world economic power, the second greatest industrial economy in the world, all built on the back of cotton, end quote. It was cotton, not coffee or rice or sugar. Cotton was the most widely traded product in the world, and it was the main ingredient in the first century of the Industrial Revolution. Enslaved laborers could be forced to pick it faster and faster at rates far exceeding what paid labor could do in other countries. Baptist again. The vast enslaved body, taken as a whole, was the biggest store of wealth in the American economy. Domestic and foreign investors profited from more cotton picked at faster and faster rates. And of course, by the expansion then of the slave enterprise from those coastal regions of its beginning all across the border along the Gulf and as far west as Texas. Slavery's expansion was the driving force in US history between the framing of the Constitution and the beginning of the Civil War. It made the nation large and unified, and it made the South's whites disproportionately powerful in that nation. But the entire nation benefited from it. It made us who we are, touching everything and everyone. Clever entrepreneurs created innovative financial tools so that more and more of the Western world was able to invest directly in the expansion of slavery. This creativity multiplied the incredible productivity and profitability of enslaved people's labor and allowed enslavers to turn bodies into commodities with which they changed the financial history of the Western world. But African Americans have not benefited from what their labor created. No 40 acres and a mule. Returning veterans from World War II were denied the loans of the newly created Federal Housing Authority. We got instead redlining, housing covenants, minimum wage jobs, substandard public housing, under-resourced public schools for their children, the back of the bus. We must remember this. The Civil War is over and the South lost. We don't remember this truth. Millions of Americans seem not to remember this. What's the evidence? It's the continued celebration of the Confederacy, the omnipresence of Confederate flags on homes, pickup trucks, roadside billboards, streets and schools, institutions of every kind named after Confederate heroes. In Tennessee, January 19th is Robert E. Lee Day, established in 2013, not 100 years ago. In 1973, Texas changed Lee Day to Confederate Heroes Day. In Florida, January 19th is Robert E. Lee Day. In the neighboring states of Alabama and Mississippi, Martin Luther King Jr. shares the third Monday in January, the federal holiday created in his honor, with Robert E. Lee Day. Arkansas has paired Lee with King on that same Monday since 1985, and I'm quoting here, after 2 years of requiring state employees to select between the two holidays or their own birthday as a day off from work. I could go on. The other states, southern states, do to what they do, others to assert their conviction that they fought and won a worthy cause, resistance to northern aggression in defense of states' rights. Slavery had little to do with it. They want us all to believe. And so they teach today in public schools, rather than the history they choose to forget. History is the fruit of power. Jones quotes Michelle Roth-Trujillo, a historian. And our nation's glorious remembrance is all but overwhelmed by an even more glorious forgetting. And here she quotes the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Blight in Race and Reunion, the Civil War in American Memory. We remember, honor, and teach about George Washington. We forget Ona Judge. We remember Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence in a rented room in Philadelphia. We forget the teenage boy serving his every need while he wrote. That boy was Robert Hemings, the half-Black brother of Jefferson's wife, Martha, born to her father and a woman he enslaved. Jefferson did not believe Robert was created equal by his creator with certain unalienable rights. The contradictions in the Declaration and the Constitution would take a bloody civil war to fully expose, but not resolve. Too many whites, too many white institutions still deny the war is lost. The nation belongs to us all. we must remember this. Civil rights have not yet been won, but the prevailing fiction says differently. Now, here's the master narrative, so called by civil rights leader Julian Bond, and summed up by Hassan Kwame Jeffries. The movement began in 1954 when the Supreme Court concedes that segregation is wrong. It gains momentum when an interracial coalition inspired by the court's bold action engages in noble acts of nonviolent protests ranging from bus boycotts to sit-ins. Dr. King leads this moral crusade and receives the unwavering support of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, who put the full weight of the federal government, including the vast resources of the FBI, behind starting a revolution against I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Let me go back just a bit. Dr. King leads this moral crusade and receives the unwavering support of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, who put the full weight of the federal government, including the vast resources of the FBI, behind it. This movement reaches its peak when Northern whites learn the disgraceful extent of racial discrimination in the South, and Southern whites recognize that racial prejudice is morally wrong. Then Congress passes landmark legislation designed to end racial discrimination. Unfortunately, African Americans are dissatisfied with remarkable progress and undermine the movement by rejecting nonviolence, by shunning well-meaning whites and embracing Black power. And finally, in 1968, Dr. King is killed, effectively ending the movement. But thankfully, by that time, America has essentially righted its racial wrongs, thereby leveling the playing field for future generations and paving the way for Barack Obama. Well, I know you know this is just wrong and harmful. The modern civil rights movement has its roots in the pre-Civil War abolition movement through Reconstruction in the early decades of the 20th century. It was broadly diverse with local organizing and activists all across the nation, north and south, east and west. It was never one monolithic movement with one charismatic leader. We have forgotten, if we ever knew, I didn't, leaders like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, about whom I want to say a few things. Frances Harper wrote a letter to John Brown in prison in November of 1859. Dear friend, although the hands of slavery throw barrier between you and me, it may not be my privilege to see you in your prison house, Virginia, has no bolts or bars through which I dread to send you my sympathy. She also wrote Mary Ann Day Brown, his wife. In an hour like this, the common words of sympathy may seem like idle words, and yet I want to say something to you, the noble wife of the hero of the 19th century. I thank you for the brave words you have spoken. A republic that produces such a wife and mother may hope for better days. Makes you wonder what Mary Brown said before her husband was executed for murder, treason, and inciting a slave revolt. And if you'll allow me a slight historic detour, tell me how this, inciting a slave revolt, is worse than starting a revolution against a distant colonial power, putting too high a price on tea. Though it makes perfect sense if we remember the deeper truth. The American Revolution was fought to keep the royal hands of King George off the rights of Southern colonists. to keep and hold their enslaved, to own the bodies of others, to continue to steal their labor and profit from their blood and guts. Nicole Hannah Jones quotes George Washington in 1774 when he, here's the quote, argued of the British that those from whom we have a right to seek protection are endeavoring by every piece of art and despotism to fix the shackles of slavery upon us. When he wrote those words, Mr. Washington, not yet president, owned 120 slaves, not counting the men, women, and children that belonged to Martha, that she brought into the marriage after the death of her first husband. He, they, we, in the 1776 origin story, used chattel slavery as a metaphor for British treatment of freewheeling, land owning, seed spreading, plantation ruling, white male colonists. Plantation, I got that in quotes, i.e. Mount Vernon, Mr. Washington's Mount Vernon. Plantation, i.e. Mr. Jefferson's Monticello. Plantation is a euphemism for forced labor camp. And you know, today there are destination weddings to plantations in South and North Carolina, Virginia, by progressive Northeasterners. Returning from my detour, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper became one of the most important, highly regarded, widely recognized abolitionists, orators, and writers of her time. Blacks and whites purchased her books and enthusiastically attended her lectures and speeches. She was a grade school teacher, a seminary professor, a writer, a renowned abolitionist, a homeowner eventually in Philadelphia, and a poet. Her most famous poem was "Bury Me in a Free Land." I learned about her in Read Until You Understand, the profound wisdom of Black life and literature by Farah Jasmine Griffith. She recited this poem, "Bury Me in a Free Land," often on the abolitionist speaking circuit, in churches, schools, colleges. It was deeply and profoundly inspiring to those who heard it. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. The shadow above my silent tomb would make it a place of fearful gloom. I could not rest if I heard the tread of a coffle gang to shambles led, and the mother's shriek of wild despair rise like a curse on the trembling air. I could not sleep if I saw the lash drinking her blood at each fearful gash, and I saw her babes torn from her breast like trembling doves from their parent nest. I'd shudder and start if I heard the bay of bloodhounds seizing their human prey, and I heard the captive plead in vain as they bound afresh his galling chain. If I saw young girls from their mother's arms bartered and sold for their useful charms, my eye would flash with a mournful flame, my death-pale cheek grow red with shame. Farah Jasmine Griffith writes, the refrain, "I could not rest," begs the question of what happens to a soul that does not find rest in death. Does it, like the ghost of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, continue to haunt the nation? And I want to add, we don't need to wonder what happens to dreams, not of the dead, but of the living. That question is answered by Langston Hughes. You know the poem, Deferred Dreams Explode. The civil rights for which Frances Harper devoted her life are still not won. The ghosts of those torched, lynched, are still haunting us. The deferred dreams of generations of African Americans are still exploding today when one after another tragedy befalls us. Strange fruit of a system that will not bend its arms to lift the least among us. We must remember this. Reparations. However uncomfortable and intractable an issue to resolve, reparations must be addressed. If ever there were a people deserving compensation for harms inflicted over centuries, they are African Americans in the United States of America. But I'm not looking for checks to be distributed. Some may, that's not what I'm looking for. Rather, institutions to be transformed, diseased systems to be dismantled and rebuilt with justice so that basic human services and opportunities long denied will be made available to communities of color that have systematically been shut out of that old standby, the American dream. Talking about, healthcare, education, employment, the franchise, voting rights, the basic cornerstone of democracy, sorely missing from Black lives, won at a cost, lost at a cost, under attack now, blood spilled, lives taken, not lost. Criminal justice system, criminal injustice system, policing. Reparations puts these on the table for revision, if not dismantling and reordering. Major repair work needs to be done here. I'm going to leave that there. I've gone on long enough. I haven't said anything about Riverside. And again, I do hope it is more thoroughly discussed in subsequent presentations. But let me conclude with a few thoughts about this church. Our home is a magnificent edifice built by perhaps the richest man in the nation's history, on land that once belonged to the Lenape Nation. Two enormous challenges face us here. The selection of a new permanent pastor and the exciting yet daunting decision regarding what to do with these 2 full blocks we own since the purchase of McGifford. Perhaps the most significant physical development and opportunity in our recent history. Right here in Morningside Heights, on the Upper West Side, in Harlem, we are in the midst of modern gentrification. I think of gentrification as an economic strategy and a social and cultural movement to reward those already privileged for the economic gain of those already wealthy at the expense of those already victimized by what we have forgotten, what we have broken and never fixed. Our opportunity for repairing comes from what we do now. How we develop our property, for financial sustainability and mission, for mission and financial sustainability. And the opportunity for repairing comes with the leader we choose to work with our lay leadership and our congregation and community to be the hands and feet of the gospel in the city and in the world today. I want to close quoting Dr. King from his 1967 Christmas sermon. It has so many of the moving and provocative words we have treasured for so long, words that still speak to us today, to this moment of remembering and repairing. He began, "Peace on earth. This Christmas season finds us a rather bewildered human race. We neither have peace within nor peace without. Everywhere, paralyzing fears harrow people by day and haunt them by night. If we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties have to become ecumenical rather than sectional. We must either learn to live together as brothers, or we are going to perish together as fools. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality, the nonviolent affirmation of the sacredness of all human life. Life is sacred. Every man is somebody because he is a child of God. So when we say thou shalt not kill, we are saying that human life is too sacred to be killed on the battlefield. And I'm sure he'd want to say anywhere else. He named the three Greek words for love, eros, philios, and agape, and explained that agape, and this is King again, seeks nothing in return. Theologians would say it is the love of God operating in the human heart. So when you rise to love on this level, you love all people, not because you like them, not because their ways appeal to us. You love every person because God loves them. In our struggle for racial justice, we can't ever give up. We must never let up in our determination to remove every vestige of segregation and discrimination from our nation. But we shall not in the process relinquish our privilege to love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. Can't you hear King speaking as much to today, 2021, as 1967? Remember and repair. Remember and repair. Remember and repair. Thank you.
Reverend Livingston, thank you so much for a really rich and deep presentation. We'll be going to question and answer soon, and then a chance for people to offer additional comment. I'm just thinking about well, more than one thing, but I know that, mentioning reparations, even in the hallways of our great liberal church, causes some people to roll their eyes. I think in part because they have a limited view of reparations as a check, which that falls so far short of the definition. And they might say, well, Riverside wasn't built by slaves. It didn't own slaves. So what is our, what might we owe in this, in the way of reparations? Could you kind of react?
Yeah, well, I've heard that said several times, and that's why I wanted to include it at the end. Of course, that's much too narrow a view, right? And I'm clearly not taking that perspective, somehow separating Riverside as a church, as an institution, apart from the larger issue of reparations for African Americans in particular, in this case, who have suffered, continue to suffer so long in this nation. How can we, why would we want to separate ourselves from looking at that question as broadly as possible? I don't have any desire to do that. And of course, we don't have to think about it, and I don't think should, narrowly as a check. One reason is we don't have enough money. There isn't enough money in the US Treasury to pay for the harm done for the last hundreds of years inflicted upon African Americans through the institution of slavery. Just that period, what was it, some 240 years maybe, and then beyond, the continuing repercussions of that in the systemic ways that racism has continued to function in our society, in our government, in our public institutions, as I tried to point out in some of my remarks. So a check devoid of addressing the systemic issues, which I tried to address, would be meaningless. The money would be spent and nothing would have changed fundamentally. If those institutions, if white racism, if white supremacy, if white privilege continue to operate, continue to infect our body politic in the way that they do now. So it's a bigger question. And it's not a question that Riverside ought to want to avoid. So it's not an issue of how much do we write, what's the size of the check we write. It's how do we participate in dismantling structures that inflict continuing pain and suffering on people we love, people we are ourselves.
I'm watching the screen. I think we're trying to see all participants so we can see if any hands are up. People can also put questions in the chat. Charlene Wingate and Bruce Lamb will be helping field questions. I'll field the first one from Reverend Dr. Adele Smith, and I'm not seeing the rest of your name. I'm so sorry. And you'll need to unmute before you speak.
Thank you, Reverend Livingston. So powerful. I wonder if you let the North off too easily. Some time back, the New York Times had an article, and too far back for me to remember the statistics, that in the early day of the colonies, it was New York that had the most slaves. We know that Wall Street is built on the money from traders and cotton mill owners and bankers. And so many of our cities, Boston, the mill towns, slaves indirectly built our cities. Sometime back, I went to the African burial ground near Wall Street, and I urge everyone, if they can, to go there. And the trauma is still visceral. Years later, walking on land where my people were buried, slaves, is very painful and beyond words.
I agree completely, absolutely. And I certainly did touch on it, but I could have hit it even harder than I did. And so thank you for pointing that out. I mentioned Connecticut factories and London banks, and I in the caricature of the completion of the work of civil rights, there clearly is this sense that it's the North looking askance at the South, but that's not a conviction I hold. It's not the truth. So thank you for adding that that note of complexity to it, but it's absolutely true. And it's part of what I was trying to say in that whole point. It's like the whole nation benefited and participated in this enterprise. When I mentioned the point, it was a quote, I think, about the creative entrepreneurs. They're North and South and East and West. The development of financial instruments. This is not something that happened just in the South, but as you say, on Wall Street, in the banking industry. The insurance industry is implicated in this. Absolutely the point that needs to be stressed. Thank you for that.
We have a question from Britton.
Okay, that's John Braden. Hi. Thank you so much, Reverend Livingston, for that wonderful, powerful speech, which should have been covered live on CNN and MSNBC. And in a better world, it would have been. My question primarily has to do with education at a time when we see this erosion of our democracy, and what is the responsibility of education, and how can education respond? Particularly, I work as an educator for the past 26 years. I've taught English at the high school level. I began my career in a troubled high school in Harlem, always opening up spaces of democratic discourse, critiquing the status quo, which is very often difficult within an educational system that is almost designed to silence and smother voices of people of low income and working people and minorities. And now I do that at the college level. In addition, my wife and I co-produce a nonprofit TV show on education. And I'm just really concerned about this. I belong to a Democratic club, the Village Independent Democrats, which is based in Greenwich Village. And Chuck Schumer spoke, and Chuck was very eloquent today, speaking at VID in Zoom. But the last time when Mr. Schumer was at VID, I brought this up to him about education, and he was very interested in that, in terms of civics and saving our democracy and developing a Democratic Party platform on education, specifically on education. And I'm wondering if Riverside might be interested in doing this, and if so, would that be through the Social Justice Committee or some other way, the Education Committee? We really have education is where it all starts, right? And we have a golden opportunity to go big on this. We have Congressman Jamal Bowman, who has actually a doctorate in education, and I'm trying to reach out to him. We have Jill Biden, the president's wife, has a doctorate in education. We need to gather educators together, and any educators at Riverside who care about social justice. I'm actually taking a course now in education for social justice in my doctoral program in educational leadership at Drexel University. And it's amazing what can be done within the space of education. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Obviously, you heard me mention education. This is critical. The response to the 1619 project has just been overwhelming. It's under vicious attack, and states all over the country are rushing to change curriculum and pass laws that will penalize teachers from telling the truth about our history. I wanted to mention, the reason I went blank there for a second, I had a magazine in my backpack I wanted to get. And I mentioned Hassan Kwame Jeffries, and he's got an essay collection called Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement. Hassan Kwame Jeffries. And it is, there is a whole curriculum of teaching the history of resistance, teaching the diversity of the movement that has been developed. And you can read about this in Learning for Justice. That's the magazine. I have to give Nancy credit for this. This is Nancy's subscription. Learning for Justice is the name of the magazine. It's the fall 2021 issue, learningforjustice.org. And then to your
Wonderful.
specific, Learning
Yeah.
for Justice.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, fabulous, fabulous.
You know, I think this is a question that the Education Commission and the Social Justice Commission ought to take up. I'm sure they would say they are engaged in some of this kind of work, but there may be other ways that they may want to be involved. Our school systems, our teachers are under attack right now for wanting to teach the truth. And there may be ways for Riverside to get involved in this. I see lots of hands, so I'm going to
Thank you.
stop.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the question.
Thank you.
Yes, we have Sumati. Sumati?
Yes, I hope we can take action on all this. I have a question about the narrative. You talked about Hannah Jones attempting to reframe the origins of our history, going back to 1619. You talked about the flawed narrative of the civil rights movement. And as I listen to you, I know I've noted that you mentioned voting rights, you mentioned the Supreme Court. I think you also mentioned the LGBTQ community. So I'm wondering what we would say, it seems to me it's about, you talked about whiteness. You know, that this issue of racism, this larger issue of the exploitation of Indigenous and Black people that help build this country is really about whiteness. And when I think about the Supreme Court, I'm thinking also a particular group of whites, the privileged, the people who have money, who are pulling all the strings of our systems, persuading people that somehow some notion of America must be maintained. So I guess I'm just raising the question of what is the narrative that captures most clearly what you've been describing? Is it enough to talk about racism, or do we have to talk more about whiteness and all that implies?
Yeah, well, of course we do. Yeah, I mean, these things didn't happen in a vacuum, devoid from the people who exercised power then and now, and then especially, we're talking about white men. That's the beginning. So that's why it's so important that Nicole Hannah-Jones goes back to 1619. So the 1776 narrative is we're being oppressed by colonial rule by Britain, and we've got to get out from under this so that we can practice democracy and govern ourselves. And again, all the while they're saying this, white men, all the while they're saying this, they're oppressing and regarding as inhuman Indigenous populations, enslaved people that they bring here and exploit in order to build their wealth and ultimately the nation. Women who are not included in this democratic project either, and even poor whites are not.
Yeah.
They have very effectively been sold the narrative that they joined this project at the point of race because they're white and because they share with the ruling class a skin color that makes them better than all else. And so, I mean, the narrative there is the fiction of race, of course, and the development of this idea that race actually means something, that color is a real thing that divides us and somehow places us, to use Isabel Wilkerson's word, caste, and it's not her word. We get this from especially India and Indian society. So that's another narrative. I didn't talk about it. I certainly implied it, but when I begin with we're human, we're all created by God, I think the affirmation there is race doesn't matter as the genesis of all of this. At its base, we all belong together. But it does matter, of course, because it's been used as a weapon. It's been wielded as a tool to separate, to dominate, to. So yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. I would want to elevate the narrative of race, of color, as something that also needs to be disestablished. And of course, that's what the anti-racism work of MSJ is all about. I'm trying to answer your question best I can offer at the moment.
Thank you.
Reverend Livingston, we have a couple of questions from the chat. One is from Barbara Howard, and she says that you spoke about transforming our institutions. What ideas do you have for a transformation to counteract the inherent racism and white supremacy built into the Constitution and laws of this country?
Yeah, you know what? This is a great question, of course. It is the question. And this is so basic. So the conservative establishment, Republican, Christian, white, in the main, I mean, it makes almost no sense to describe it in any other way, if that makes any sense. Capitalist, I suppose. They have been working for decades to achieve what they're about to achieve. Total control of the government, right? They got the Supreme Court, they're working on Congress. We're going to see how these midterm elections turn out. Who knows what will happen in the 2024 election, but it almost won't matter, even if it's a Democrat, if they get control of the Supreme Court and Congress. So it's a long way around to say that's exactly the kind of thing that needs to happen. By we who believe in justice will not rest until, right? We have to seize control of the decision-making apparatus of our country, the power that shapes the institutions that we've all been talking about in this conversation. This is a work that Obama and Eric Holder have been involved in, right? This whole redistricting work that's going on. White, conservative, Christian, Republican, wealthy, they've taken over state legislatures, most of them, the majority of them in our nation. And they're they've taken over control of the Supreme Court, and they're working on both houses of Congress. It's that simple. These institutions have to be transformed by basically organizing. It's grassroots organizing. It's protecting voting rights. It's that's what it's about.
Dr. Akome?
I'm very sorry, I have spotty internet. I was wondering if, since the foundation of the country involved conquest of what was previously Mexican land, and then purchase of other lands that included Latino or Latinx people. And then, there's the Asian community also, and the exclusion for almost a century or so. Shouldn't we also include these populations when we're thinking about the history of the country and marginalization and extreme exploitation of non-white people? I'm also thinking I'm also wondering about the kind of education we need, because I think it's civic education, and civic education that is determined to properly contextualize the history of the country and what is at stake for all of us at this moment and moving forward. And I'm wondering what the role of the church ought to be in facilitating this, and also in kind of showing an example of the kind of community that reflects these values of inclusion, of conscious embrace of all of us, because we're all children of God.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that. So the specific task I thought I was responding to, reparations, remember and repair, had to do with somewhat narrowly the African American experience. But you'll note I took great pains at the beginning to identify, first of all, the indigenous populations here, because I wanted to establish this isn't just about African Americans and slavery. The United States, the story of this country cannot be told effectively without especially the Black bodies, which are at the heart of this experience, the building of the nation. And but of course, in the course of time, that ruling elite that we've been talking about, and I want to say, and it's not just elites, but I keep white, Republican, of course, they were Democrats in an earlier century, Christian, especially the wealthy class, but also the middle and lower classes as well, the educated and the uneducated. Over the course of time, they've exploited and oppressed every group that's come here. Taken the whole fight in the Southwest over Texas with Mexico was about the expansion of slavery, and the history of the Alamo, and all of these things that you mentioned, they're very important. The Chinese work on the railroads, and all these are stories that are critically important to us, and they feed into and off of the history that I've been describing with African Americans. But absolutely, these stories ought also be elevated, and they are a part of the larger narrative that I've been talking about. I'm not sure I got your middle point about the role of church in I think maybe the role of church in education. So I'm just going to leave that alone. Feel free to circle back to it if you'd like, but
yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of more hands raised. Martha, followed by Colleen. Dr. Burchett.
Thank you, Reverend Livingston. I just wanted to say, for those who don't know this, one of the reasons why he is presenting today, one, because he's an excellent storyteller, but also he felt as if he wasn't as prepared as he wanted to for the previous one, so he volunteered to come. I haven't heard him say anything about volunteering again, but I'm waiting for that, Reverend McFarland, and we look forward to you coming back and working with us. Two things. One, if you can submit to us, to myself or Carol, I know we'll get your paper for the archives, but also your bibliography, so that we can post that online for those who might be interested in beginning some reading on reparations and African American history and slavery. That would be helpful. The other thing, just in terms of the reparations question, we were looking at African Americans in particular, because in the United States, there have been a number of reparation payments out from 1971 to 1990, totaling a few $1 billion, I guess, to Alaska Native Americans, land, and just a number of people, which would be a part of our overall story. But we have still been fighting, African Americans are still fighting just for that recognition and the right to even begin this larger conversation in the United States. And it has been worsened over the last few years, coming out of the Trump administration and the just profound racism that is pervading our government, state, local, and national. So just want to say that, so if we can get that bibliography, that would be fantastic. And Carol and I will have it, and Bruce will have it posted on the website this week.
Dr. Burchett?
Okay. I was going to say, first of all, I'm aware, I did a little research, and I am aware of Reverend Livingston's background, which is really fantastic. And I'm glad that Riverside is making use of that in the crafting of this series and so forth. So he has such wisdom that I'm going to pose the questions for him. I'm aware of the fact, and most people are aware of the fact, that one of the strengths of the abolitionists and the civil rights movement was the coalition between quote unquote white versus quote unquote black forces that got together to push to dismantle some of the systemic evils that were present that kept us bound in slavery, and then later on that we had to fight in order to deal with fallout from Reconstruction, so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is today, however, I am aware, I seem to be aware of the divisions among some of our traditional allies, like quote unquote, I always say quote unquote, because race is really doesn't exist, but white progressives, the progressive movement, there are divisions there. And there's little spoken of real divisions among the Black community that are class divisions and religious divisions. Now, what a question I wanted to pose is this real? Am I describing something that's real to the extent that it is a problem for us? And if it is real, given your background, and you've dealt with some real stuff in the course of your development, in the political sphere. What do you think we need to do in order to produce the type unity that would be necessary for the traditional allies to come together and take down something like a Trump type coalition on the far right? Do you get my question? You're muted. Do you understand the question, Dr. Weber?
Yeah, I think so. I'm probably not as aware as to the extent that you are what some of those barriers are, what some of those factions or divisions are. I'm not sure that I could, but I think what I want to say is the problem is so huge, so enormous, and requires organizing and work and advocacy and protests and legislative initiatives and economic initiatives. It's so vast that we don't need to think that we somehow need to all be together, all doing the same thing at the same time in order to get the kind of work done that needs to be done. So remember, one of the points that I made was, and again, reading people smarter than I who've studied this. So the civil rights movement wasn't just, 1954 to 1968, and King was the leader, but that movement had many parts to it and many leaders to it and local expressions of it. So that's, I think, what's required now. We jump in where we have the interest, where we have the resources, where we have the passion, where we have the ability to move something, to make something happen. John wants to work on education, and Sumati is concerned about whiteness and its continuing ability to divide and conquer and rule. So, you go where you're led and where it makes sense to expend your energy and to gather your resources. And there will be these moments when something will be on the table that's so compelling that folks from all over will gather to push that particular thing across the finish line. And I think that's sort of the way it works, rather than the effort to build a large cohesive movement. I mean, that's what's happening when the Poor People's Campaign, and still half people in America have any idea what that is or who William Barber is, but they keep doing what they're doing. And I think that's kind of the way I see it.
Thank you.
We just have a couple of more questions, if you're up to it, Reverend Livingston. I know they've been wearing you out with all these different areas, but we enjoy you so much. We just can't wait to hear what you have to say next.
I'm
So
good. Let's keep going.
keep going. Regina?
Hi, I just I guess have more of a comment than a question. One of the things that is of great concern to me, particularly when you're talking about education, is the amount of time it takes to get, the history corrected and to confront these issues, particularly around critical race theory. I think that this white supremacist ideology is really on fire against the 1619 Project, mostly because they've been successful in being able to have full control of the narrative on the racial history of the country. But what I'm concerned about is how long it takes to get something done. But what I'm really thinking is that on the issue of voting, it seems to me that if we're not wrapping our fist around that achievement and fighting back, we won't even have a place at the table to talk about education reform. And that's the thing that concerns me. One thing I do know about the civil rights movement is that there were many people, many leaders confronting different issues, and they were effective because they were everywhere. And I think that the hardest part for those of us in the social justice movement is understanding that the battle on a certain level is permanent, in a sense that when there is progress, as there was during the 50s and 60s, there's a movement across the country to basically take back all of those achievements. So, but what heartens me is that progress can be made. Radical progress can be made coming out of groups that just function exactly as we are. But the timetable, I'm thinking about the midterm elections. I think that we also have discouraged people in the movement who are saying, the house is literally on fire. How can we handle all of this? Well, we did before, but that was done, I think, largely because people identified what issue they were most concerned about and got right after them and worked on that particular area. So I hope I'm not talking too long, but I think the things that are most immediate for me is educating the electorate on how important the local races are, the smaller, I'll say smaller jobs, for lack of a way of putting it. Because Barack Obama came to power, but people didn't support the candidates that would have supported his agenda, which is why I think the Republican Party had such success in basically at many times trying to completely immobilize the administration. So there's a lot of
let me respond to some of that before you add more to
I'm
it.
not discouraged by it, but I think it has to be very targeted. So I'll be quiet. No, I'm sorry.
No, look, beautiful. You raised a lot of really important issues. So, I do think right now, voting rights, we got to all get on that as to the extent that we can, because that really is critical. What they're doing now is vitally, terribly destructive and vitally important to us, and it affects everything, right? Voting rights, it affects everything. Just the threat to Roe v. Wade. I just, It's horrific what they're talking about in Texas and the effect this is having on women's lives and their ability to control their own bodies and their need to be able to make health decisions about themselves and having to travel to other states to do it. And that won't change until the legislature in Texas changes and the Supreme Court changes. So voting rights is critical. That's just to talk about it in one area. This critical race theory, same thing. It is these local legislatures and state governments and local school boards that are terrorizing people who want to tell the truth about our history. And the more that truth isn't told, the more we don't remember accurately our history, the more young people, young white kids who grow up, especially them, but not them alone, but they're the ones who will be in a position to perpetuate these injustices. So it's very important that these things happen right now. So I didn't say things like, I also think that we need to be working on the filibuster, and we need to return to a simple majority in the Senate because there's a bottleneck there. The Electoral College, I think, needs to be abolished. It was a tool of the elite, white Southern plantation owners. That's, I think, another institutional, structural, systemic weakness that's compromised the quality of our lives. The Second Amendment, it's a relic, and you know what it is? It's a big gun store. Y'all come, whoever you are, get whatever you want. So there are these, and then the thing you haven't said, and this is tongue in cheek here. You haven't even mentioned planet Earth. And it is in the balance in all of these questions.
Yes.
So let me stop because there may be others. I don't see any.
We do have a couple of more in the chat and such, but we're going to throw it to Carol for a quick question and then on to Linda.
It's actually a comment that fits right here. In follow-up to each of the Remember and Repair sessions, we'll be proposing an action to take during the coming weekend on into the future. And definitely what was just mentioned that one of the most important things we can do is to support equity and justice in access to voting. Bruce will be putting in the chat an action guide that you can download in the chat. I will also email it to you, that just, simple template to follow to do your advocacy for the two voting rights bills that are before the Congress.
Okay.
Not just an education and research series, it's also an action series. And that's the action for today. And then I'll also post information from Riverside's Lift Every Voice and Vote project. Write postcards or make phone calls with Reclaim Our Vote, which is a nonpartisan voting rights group with a strong relationship to Riverside, and is attacking this really huge problem state by state. So look in the chat and in your email for that information.
Okay.
Linda, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Reverend Livingston, for such a wonderful presentation. As I've often told you, I was sitting here with a pen and pencil, jotting everything down you said. I have a couple of questions and some observations. To piggyback off something Regina said, voters must turn out, especially in those battleground states that have Trump-backed candidates. The idea is to defeat those candidates in the primaries, and then we can breathe a little easier come November because all the Trump people will not have made it on the ballot. Also, Cheryl and Eiffel, on a recent interview with Chris Hayes, made an interesting statement. She said every major improvement in civil rights legislation has come on the heels of, I guess, an unpleasant event, i.e. January 6th. And
Yes.
she feels that Because of that, if that energizes people enough, we'll get out and make sure that the Trump approved candidates are defeated in the primaries, that we can move people in the Senate to perhaps break the filibuster and allow the voting rights bill to be enacted. Thirdly, an observation. If you remember, Hitler sent people to this country to study our racism laws prior to his movements in Germany in the 1930s. He sent people here. Now, how do they do this? The next thing I wanted to mention, Pope Francis really got himself in a whole lot of trouble when he tried to make Fray Junipero Serra a saint. A lot of Native American peoples got very angry about that. He went on and did it anyway. Another thing that I noted was that, and I've forgotten which state it was, attempted reparations, and I put that in quotes, by paying every Black family in that particular town $25,000, which would not even allow them to have a down payment on a house. And the local civil rights activists got together and said, no, we want the institutions reformed, because you're still not helping out the Native American population. And a lot of the creation of this country came from purchasing land that had been taken from Native Americans, i.e. the Louisiana Purchase, or defeating the Alamo. A lot of people don't know that was part of Texas, part of Mexico. We basically stole Texas. And there were other things. There's a book out called Forget the Alamo, which tells the real issues of slavery and things that went on. We bought Alaska from the Russians, who took it from the Native Americans. So a lot of this country, we overthrew a legitimate government of Hawaii. So a lot of this country has been acquired by taking things or buying from people who took things.
Amen.
So we have a long way to go.
That requires no comment. That's all truth. All truth.
Okay, we have two last comments and questions from the chat. One was brought up by Jennifer James Soto, who basically put out there, are we on the precipice of becoming pre-1994 South Africa? And then the final question would be, how do you explain people of color who somehow have been brainwashed by acquired elevations in educational attainments, money and positions, fail to recognize that all people of color are in the same struggle? How do you re-educate such miseducated folks and the reach of the church in such situations? From Moyo Okome, and I hope I did say his name well.
Yeah, wow. Well, listen, to Jennifer's, I think I'm a glass half full. I'm a glass 3/4 full. I'm a glass full kind of person. And I'm as afraid now about the future as I've ever been. It's frightening what is happening, and the way we're able to actually put huge numbers on people who are just pulling in another direction and comfortable denying the humanity of other people, women, around issues of gender and non-binary and women's bodies and the earth. And I mean, it's the list is endless, and there is this aggressive misinformation and mistruth and denial of basic human rights from the right. And they've got the tools, the media. John always likes to talk about the media, but I mean, Fox News and it's what we're seeing is, I think it's unprecedented, and it's frightening to me. And I would, so yeah, I mean, I do think we're at some risk of becoming something horrific, or what is horrific is being exposed, and the threats to deepen this are omnipresent, and we all need to be concerned about this. And I just want to mention too, the earth, and I do think that we're right at the edge of, it's not funny, why am I laughing? We're right at the edge of just a viable planet, and we are not doing enough to reverse these terrible trends. And then to that second question about folks who don't get what we get, and some of them being people that we would describe as of color. So I recognize that there is that dimension out there. So one thing I want to say, and just to localize it for just a moment, a child born of one white parent and one African-American parent, or one white parent and one Japanese-American parent, they get to say who they are. They get to define their own identity and reality. And I'm not going to get in the middle of that. I think anybody born to any parents has to come to grips with realities about who we are as a nation. And I do want to address it in that regard. But so many things are happening now about personal identity that I think, for me, the way I'm comfortable addressing it is to say, and I guess it goes to some extent back to what Sumati raised, this whole race thing is a fiction. And when the sea levels rise and overwhelm the coast of the Northeast and the Gulf of Mexico, just to stick right here in the United States, and when there is no more water for Californians to drink because of what's happening in Colorado, and when the fires keep burning, this race thing, it's going to go up in smoke or go underwater. Or we have a human problem today, and we have to address it in the final analysis in that way, to say, which is not to deny that we do need to continue to operate in very specific realities that govern communities among us. Is that clear?
Indeed. I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Yes, thank you, Charlene. Thanks so much. We have a couple, just a very few minutes for wrap-up tasks. Before we go to that, join me in thanking Reverend Livingston for this opportunity to learn from him and to be inspired and challenged and sent forward on this important task of remembering and repairing. So please join me in thanking Reverend Livingston. Applause, cheers, hand waves are all welcome.
Thank you back.
Thank you.
Thank you all back for putting up with this. Oh my.
Putting up with is definitely not how I would describe my deep love for you, actually. So thank you so much. All right, guys. So now, as we wrap up, please enter in the chat your 1 or 2 takeaways from the session, especially the insights you gained on what must Riverside remember and what is ours to repair. We'll give you a few minutes for that. And once you've finished entering your comments, you may log off. We look forward to seeing you again on January 23, when, as Martha announced, Dr. Gary Dorian will offer insights into Riverside's founding pastor, the Reverend Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick. And one final note, respondents Robbie, Pam, Martha, Bruce, Lori, and Charlene, please stick around in this Zoom room for a short debriefing session after participants have jotted their comments and have left. And thank all of you so very much for your participation.
If I may, I mean, I think all of these sessions are going to be great, but please don't miss Gary Dorian. He is amazing.
Yeah.
And he's
And the seminary president.
scholar.
And the seminary president. They're all going to be great.
Yes.
So.
Yep.
And I saw Clarence Anderson's hand. So Clarence, send me a text and tell me what you were going to say. Please ask or comment.
No, that was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you all for your questions and your comments. This has been great. Thank you.
Mhm. And thank you, Reverend Livingston. And I do have that third session for you.
All right.
It's coming.
Yes.
Thank you, Reverend Livingston.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Goodbye and thank you, everyone. What a wonderful program. Actually, I feel so encouraged.
Mhm.
I feel we got religion here over the pandemic. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mhm.
And notice the email address education@trcnyc.org for further takeaways and for any follow-up comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and we'll email out the recording later today. Some people have messaged they came in late and wanted to watch the entire session before submitting takeaways. So once you watch the recording, you can email your takeaways to us, and we'll include them with gratitude. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bruce.
We're really grateful for everybody's feedback,
Mhm.
how we repair, remember and repair in community.
Mary, do you have a question? We see your hand up, Mary Lorick, if we can help in any way.
I apologize. I do not have a question. I just wanted to say thank you. It
Thanks,
was really
Mary. Thanks for being here.
a great
Thanks.
insight.
We have quite the plethora of amazing takeaways in the chat here. So I think it'll be a rich, robust conversation.
Good.
Thanks all for submitting your takeaways, sticking around.
Charlene will be able to download those, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Mhm.
I'm also saving them as we go.
Okay.
We could, even while people are finishing up and logging off, I'd love it if the respondent group members would share your takeaways. And what, of course, what do they have to say about, what's Riverside's role in remembering and repairing? Next steps that emerging for our church. Now that's a lot in one fell swoop. So perhaps just start with what your main takeaway was as a designated respondent. And that would be Robbie, Charlene, Lori, Martha, Bruce.
Pam.
And we have Robin here from the Education Commission too, to debrief.
Robin, great. Great. Someone pitch in?
I can start. I think one thing that's sitting with me is this whole idea of the mythological narrative and how that is clearly important for the people who it benefits to maintain. But also just amazed with the narratives that come from Reverend Livingston, for instance, that add to that story. And so it just kind of hit me how much of the power is in the story and the storytelling, and how important it is that we include those types of not necessarily just reflections, but even projections, in our work.
Yeah. But storytelling is also truth telling, which I thought was very powerful. Yeah.
See Robbie?
I think one of the things that hit the hardest is that someone wrote in the chat that we've always been an apartheid country. And that is so true. And it's just so hard. I think the other thing is white people have always used religion to oppress everyone that wasn't white, and including some white people, because there's a lot of oppression of women too. Women of color, of course, always has been, still is, and white women also. And it just feels so morally incredibly corrupt, and that's our history, and continues to be what our country is. And yet we're trying to be a democracy. We're in tremendous fear that we will lose what little democracy there might be. So it's like we're on a precipice, on a cliff of where we go and how will we define ourselves going forward. Can we have the moral courage to, and the conviction to change this? And can we do this? I mean, or go down, or it's almost, it feels like a fight to the death. It really does.
Other takeaways, and then we'll circle back to what's Riverside have to do with this. Lori?
Hi, I'm not sure that you'll be able to hear me, so let me know if I start to go in and out, because you're all going in and out.
But I'll assume that if nothing happens, that you can hear me. So I think I have 2 points that I want to make, and one might be perhaps restating what Pamela just said about the narrative. I didn't hear all of it, but I think it's really important for us to have, not only a personal narrative for why anti-racism is important to us personally, but also an institutional narrative that that we all agree upon, feel comfortable with, and can sort of articulate as a community. And I try to, I'm thinking about this also as sort of, everybody needs to have their own personal narrative of like, what do I believe anti-racism is? How do I feel like I can develop an anti-racist critique of my life, of my community, of my country? And so this idea of narrative developing or storytelling, I think, is really important. And it leads me to this, I think about how that term critical race theory has been so abused by the right. It has origins in legal theory and the work of Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, but it's been sort of, just sort of so, abused and oversimplified. But I think that it is a symptom really of how successful that we've been in this country in teaching about the multiple experiences in this country. And that doesn't mean that, by successful, I don't mean that we're, that we all know what we're supposed to know about, Native American history or the Latinx experience or feminism, or it's not to say that we've sort of, come to this sort of ultimate place of knowledge, but to say that the fact that this is entered into a dialogue is something that is threatening, I think we can take as sort of an instance of like its endurability in our discourse, and its threat, for people who find that threatening on the right. But I think, that tells me that that it is really crucial that we sort of see where we are now and not go back to, say, like the 80s where, anti-racism or, or this knowledge of, inequality in our society wasn't kind of like on the tip of everyone's tongue in the way that it is now. I hope I'm making sense. I'm not saying we're there, but I'm saying that we talk about it differently nowadays. And we talk about it in a way that reflects a certain basis of knowledge that we didn't have, say, 20, 30 years ago. And so we are in a different position when we talk about anti-racism. And I think getting that language down and that sort of ideological position down for ourselves, I think will help make us stronger advocates for what it is that we want to accomplish. Please let me know if that was not clear, and I'll try to clarify.
We're not in the 80s anymore. I like that.
Yeah, but the story is still there. One of the things that we'll hear from Serene Jones, the president of Union Theological Seminary, I'll even ask to make, I can't imagine her not doing it, but she shared a story which could have been attached to what Michael talked about today as another narrative about her family living next door to, or 2 houses down in Oklahoma from people who lynched 2 people in the Oklahoma community she grew up in. And the town was so small, and so they can probably stand on one street and see that. But what it did for her as a young child growing up, and how it shaped her life, even as now a theologian and an ethicist and the president of a seminary. So when Lori, first of all, I'm glad to meet you. I kept hearing your name from Carol, so finally I'm glad to meet you. But when we look at the evolution of narrative, part of it dealing, I think I heard Michael talk about highlighting narrative, is how does that narrative become a part of our purging of ourselves? of some of the evil that we have inherited, the racism we have inherited, rather than sort of doing a lot of external work. Eddie Glaude talked about this when he talked about Serene's new book. The transformation comes because there is a kind of self-purging of the self outward into community, where the impact of that transformation then becomes somewhat contagious, at least among the people that you are with. So as we develop that language, it has to be more, and you're not saying this at all, Lori, but for myself, it has to be more of an external kind of language that we talk about, but that which comes, especially from the faith communities, that comes from the core of who we are, the witness that we are called to be and to bear.
Others, perhaps others who have not spoken. Uh-huh. Do we have some thoughts?
Well,
about...
I can.
Yes, go ahead. Charlene, go ahead.
Something that really stuck out to me, a couple of things, were the issue that reparations must be addressed if we are to be made whole, and that for any chance of us to have peace, our loyalties have to become ecumenical rather than sectional. And even if we weren't talking about racism as our area of focus, that being kind and living a life that does not divide us is something that we are continually struggling with as humans. But particularly in the context of race and viewing African Americans and the indigenous people as humans first is a major struggle that seems to undermine many of our attentions on a level that many of us don't even realize. We don't even necessarily recognize how those underpinnings in our thought process is what contributes to the idea that it's okay for African American children to be illiterate. It's okay, they have better than what they had before, right? According to some, that's an underpinning understanding of thinking of African Americans as being less than valued as other humans. So those were things that, those are just a couple of things that, an array of comments that took me into a number of places, especially around the topic of education and African Americans and indigenous communities who are, till this day, had a great disparity in regards to the level of education and quality of education they are exposed to, entitled to, or afforded in their own communities. It is separate, but definitely not equal.
I actually think one of the biggest issues that we have facing us is voting rights. You know, because I think, you know, this country is supposed to be a democracy, but we know that it's really not. It is not. And it's going to become a totalitarian country. It's going to become a dictatorship. I mean, that's my fear. I mean, maybe that's crazy. That's my fear. So if we don't get a Voting Rights Act passed, I fear that if you are a person of color, if you're gay, if there's anything that puts you out of whatever a white, privileged, rich, powerful person who wants to keep a non-inclusive lifestyle, then we're in real trouble. I mean, it's not even going back into the 50s and 60s. I'm talking about the 20s and 30s and previous, you know, it's police brutality, it's lynchings, we're in that situation to a certain degree today. It's just that it's a little bit more, it's not quite as obvious maybe, but it really is from what we see and watch and read in the newspapers of all the killings of Black people. So it seems like a good place to start is with voting rights, so that there's some opportunity for us to have the right, have the voice to change local, state, and the federal government to change the institutional racism that kills us all. So please, whatever your thoughts are, I want to be a part of it, but I certainly don't have the answers. But I look to you for a lot of answers. So everybody here is very smart and had a lot of experiences throughout their lives that we can all share together. But we got to figure out how do we have an organized voice? Because the people that we've all spoken about that are so powerful, they've been doing this. Our whole history of America is about powerful people who are continuing to hang on to the Electoral College and call the shots. So when are we going to be able to figure out how to have a narrative, as you said earlier, so that we, the power of democracy, is alive and people have an equitable and fair chance to live their lives together and as one people, not as Black, white, Native American, Asian, but as one. I don't know, that's my thinking.
Mhm. I have some hope from the Homer Plessy ruling this week, and also from Claudette Colvin, where the governors and attorneys general pardoned them for the crime that took place with Colvin, the 15-year-old pregnant girl who refused to get up out of her seat when a young white woman got on the bus. And this was in Alabama. It led to the Alabama bus boycott with Rosa Parks instead as a representative. But she said something, and I shared this with Carol. And Robbie, I think I'm trying to respond to your comment. She said when they asked her, why didn't you get up? And she said the weight of history glued her to her seat. She could not get up. And then she said it was Sojourner Truth had one hand on one shoulder and Harriet Tubman had her hand on her other shoulder and basically told her, don't get up. That's a powerful statement for a 15-year-old to hold for 60 some odd years before she is pardoned by the state for a crime she really didn't commit. That was the point. She was sitting in the Black section on the bus. So that's one thing. And I say that because it gives me hope that I don't know that we have to wait for 60 some years for that to happen, But with the collective voice and the energy, the power and the love for democracy and oneness that we're talking about, and then the masses of people who are pro-democracy and pro-human in a lot of ways. We see that through the Black Lives Matter movement and a number of the other demonstrations we've had globally for the last year. I have hope that we can galvanize in a very structured way, meaning people really serious about the focus on the many aspects of what it takes to be a democratic society to move forward in that way. But the Homer Plessy one, the story is still coming out. And you know that he's the young guy who could pass for white, but they chose him as they did with Rosa Parks to sit in that car where it was for train car for whites only. And it was to make the case. But he was pardoned because he did something wrong. But what he did wrong was governed by a wrong law. So how do you undo that kind of thing? So I think for me, and again, and that's over 100 years, how do we begin to look more critically about the things that we want to change, and to use Michael's language and also Pam's, get to know the narrative. Because if you don't know the narrative, we're not going to be able to make the kind of structural changes that we want to make. And one of the biggest ones is that we have to talk about the lie. And we have to use a megaphone to talk about the lie, as right media does, perpetuating the lie. And that takes a kind of boldness, but it also takes a very rigorous form of education that relentlessly pushes for the truth. Reparations is about truth telling. And it's not about money. Some people will say, you know, different ways of looking at it. But it's also about addressing pain and trauma that people continue to face, and how that can also silence people rather than release the narratives that can be very poetic in our lives. So those are some of the things that I'm hoping that as we move forward becomes a part of a working narrative for programs that allow us to be the change that we're trying to be.
Martha, that's really helpful. And I think particularly when we talk about narrative, because not only do we need to be talking about narrative at Riverside Church, but I think what needs to happen is our leaders, our leaders in government, our president has made a statement that was helpful a few days ago, but you know, the senators, the congressmen and women, they've got to, particularly the Democrats, they've really got to get organized and have a narrative that calls out those lies, and they should have been doing it for years now. And that's so important. It's absolutely critical, is that everybody's on the same page.
Absolutely. I know there was some comments in the chat. I wanted to make sure we, Robin, Jennifer, Reiner, some great feedback in the chat. Anyone else if you want to expand more on those comments, want to make sure we get everyone in before we wrap up. Make sure we didn't miss the comments in the chat. This is great.
While they're thinking, I know they just, you know, have a moment to collect their thoughts. I wanted to I guess make the comment about what Michael said about how what's going on in our country right now is a decades long plan to seize control of the power apparatus that controls our nation. With that in mind, I just want to point out that that decades long journey did not do one thing at a time. They were attacking multiple areas at a time. So in our pursuit of trying to determine how we should look at things, we might want to consider that we can do more than one thing at a time. It just takes a great deal of organization to make sure that the resources are distributed in a manner in which we can do each of those things in an effective way so that we can push forward. Because if we look at it as only one thing at a time, we will not be able to combat the forces that are working feverishly without rest to kill every opportunity. So just wanted to throw it out there.
And we got to do coalition building in the communities as well.
Yeah.
Jennifer, would you say another word about your comment? How do we enlighten the base that our movement is their movement? They've been hoodwinked, bamboozled. I'm intrigued by your comment.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I've been thinking, because this happens over and over again. Like when you think about the slave patrols and you think about all this and who were the initial police officers, or they were the poor whites, right? The poor whites who didn't have property, who didn't have enslaved humans, and they were and so we're back to this. And then I thought about the labor movement. So there was a period in time in history where we had Black and white people working together during that labor movement. And then it was dismantled, or was becoming dismantled. And it's happening again now. You look and you see the base is not the wealthy people. And so if we're looking at it in terms of voting rights, well, how do we take away their power, meaning white, male, prosperous, capitalist Republicans? It's their base. We shift their votes. How do we get their votes? Because we can't procreate and have enough people to outvote certain areas. And we aren't willing to move to the geographic regions. We aren't willing to move to like North Dakota, Iowa, those places where we can outnumber and outvote. So how do we connect with them again like it was during that labor movement period, or some other way, so that we can take votes from those who are trying, the Trumpeteers and the ultra Republicans who don't really care about others. And so that's what I was thinking. How do we enlighten them to move towards our side, quote unquote, our side, to see that the story is not us, them, but to see that we share that same story and see how they have been manipulated. So they've been bamboozled and hoodwinked. And how do we do it?
Our base, yeah.
We got to get rid of the Electoral College, because Trump won a lot of the states, although he didn't win the popular vote and ultimately the Electoral College, by those small rural communities that were able to have electorates that normally they would not have had the system not set it up so that they can get the 2 and 3 and 4 electorates. It's just amazing to me. And then Jennifer, and even when we move to North or South Dakota, if too many of me moves there, they're going to do the redistricting thing. So it really is a big challenge. Now, I'll be honest with you, my concern is New York, and people don't quite believe this, but New York maybe become a little more of a red state than a blue state. Because when we look at gentrification is not in the form of a brownstone. It's in form of a 3250-story building. And that's a lot of votes there. And you're looking at buildings that are only the wealthy or very highly financed people can move into. And that's right here in Harlem. And there was a big report on how Harlem is becoming the new sort of urban suburban area. And they were talking about wealth. And that's going to have a lot to do with the vote, because I don't see that as being a democratic vote, because you're going to vote your pocketbook. And that's not necessarily the democratic way. So I think there are a lot of things that we have to look at in terms of taking for granted New York being the old New York. Staten Island, a number of communities are changing. People are voting their pocketbooks selfishly and a lot of other ways. So how do we educate with the historical narrative that still lives and thrives today. And I think that's about race. And that is something we really need to look at. And I am at this point in coalition building with other churches in our communities.
We're coming up to the committed ending time to respect your time on this Sunday afternoon. But Linda, your hand was up. Love to hear your comment.
That's okay. That's okay.
Oh, no, this time.
Yeah. There were several remarks that Martha made about Claudette Colvin and about the voting rights. And as I said, I think I may have made a remark in the chat. Somebody mentioned we have to contact the people in Texas, etc. But you've got to contact people here in New York.
That's right.
You've got to contact people in all the quote unquote swing states.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
God help me. I never thought I'd commend Liz Cheney, but she's going to be primaried in Wyoming.
Yeah.
Contact people in Wyoming. Defeat the guy who's primarying Liz Cheney. All right, you've got it. Once you stop it in the primaries, then you can breathe a little bit easier. Not much easier. But that might be something that the church could get involved with. Pennsylvania, Arizona, Texas, of course, Wyoming. Write postcards, make phone calls. If the people do not get out to vote, then we're done for. We're done for.
Right.
I think voting rights. It's just been very interesting listening to your discussion and taking it all in. That is where we have to start. For example, Representative Joe Neguse out in California, I think, is about to be redistricted out. He was on the impeachment committee. So we've got to defeat the people who have these positions to do this, and everybody has to get out and vote. That's so important. And that's why we are in the position that we're in. Why did Lindsey Graham win? Why did what's his face? Moscow Mitch win? People just keep putting the same people in without thinking about, without taking the long view. Carol mentioned that, you know, many these things have been in the planning stage for decades. They've been trying to defeat Roe v. Wade for decades, and they wanted to plant the Supreme Court so that they could do this. Trump did not just suddenly come on the scene.
Right, yeah. Well, and this is a good place to give a shout out to Reclaim Our Vote and postcarding and calls, which are getting in these really critical states.
Mm-hmm. And Rosalind Carter made a statement many years ago. She was talking about Ronald Reagan. And she said, this is a man that makes us all feel very comfortable with our prejudices.
Mm.
And the Oracle of Orangeburg just made people feel more comfortable in expressing their prejudices. They were already there. They weren't new.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to take a decades-long push to right the wrongs that have been done.
One of the things that Michael said that really gets me in the gut, because I've seen it in the placards on TV, is the children have now picked up the gauntlet of racism. And I remember when in one of the southern states, I don't remember which one, but there's a little white kid holding a placard that was larger than she was. And it read, what is it? How did it read? Not, another not platitude, but excellence, meaning not affirmative action, but excellent, not critical racism, but excellent. as if knowing the other is wrong. Knowing the other will destroy them. And this was a child holding that. And it's very true, you know, the movements, a lot of the white racists and white supremacist movements now are young people.
Mm.
So we have a lot of work to do.
So I don't want to cut this off unduly. Just watching the time and trying to moderate in a way. I've been copying off the chat, which is for the entire the whole afternoon, and I'm planning to look at it just on my own time to discern some themes from that. If you have time to do that and send a few comments to education@trcnyc.org, that will help us, I think, in the synthesis process. And, of course, just curious, we'll have different respondents or reflectors for each of the sessions, but there will also be some continuity. And those of you who were responders, reflectors for this session, who expects to be able to reflect after the Dorian section? I think there are a couple. Okay, Dr. Pam.
Of course, I'll be at all of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Martha.
If you're looking for volunteers, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So that started on our list for then, yeah.
We have a few council members, Patrice Salmon, and one other person. It may be Christian. I can't think of her last name. But Salmon and Patrice will be there also.
So Phil Salmon and Patrice Harrington.
Right.
Dr. Pam, your hand is up.
No, my hand was up just to make sure that you got your count correct. I'm good.
Okay. Also, just to mention, speaking of Dr. Pam, the Anti-Racism Task Force meets next Saturday, and an ongoing agenda item during the Remember and Repair series will be debriefing also on what we're hearing. So we're really very consciously working both through faith and through anti-racism to kind of synthesize the threads that are emerging here.
Absolutely.
And before we go, I was just very pleased with the attendance. The highest I saw was 83. That's extraordinary. That was fantastic.
Yeah, we had 83 people come at the high point. Yeah. We started losing people about an hour 15 in, but that's great. We had people stay for that long.
Yeah. Very good.
Friends, I have to jump off. It's been a long day, but a wonderful, wonderful time together. I'll leave the Zoom room open. Y'all can stay all night if you want. Enjoy. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Bruce and
Feel better.
Colleen. I mean, what is your name? Wingate, for doing the tech for us. Really appreciate that.
Yes.
Thanks, Charlene. Thanks, Martha, so much.
All right, thanks,
Cheryl.
everybody. Yeah.
Nice meeting you and Lori. Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
All right.
Great job,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Okay. Carol, could you stay on a second?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Bye, everyone. I just switched to my
Pam,
phone.
yeah.
I should have done about an hour earlier because I couldn't hear anything, but it was very nice
Okay.
talking with you all and listening to what I could.
And meeting you. Yeah. I heard a lot of good things from Carol about you and Lori. So that was good. You and Robbie. Yeah.
The briefing session has been wonderful. I've learned a lot just listening.
Great.
I'd be happy to give reflections at any meeting I can attend.
Right.
I may
Okay.
not
Thank you.
all of them.
Right. Linda, are you representing one of the groups that you belong to?
I hadn't planned to, but I could. I'm on Tarot League
Right,
and
because I'm thinking that.
Professional Women and the Business
Right,
Professional Women's Club.
right,
So
because
I can
that would give
represent.
us voice in both of those areas. So that would
Okay.
be fantastic if you can do that.
Okay. I can
Mhm,
do
yeah,
that.
great.
Great.
I can do that. No problem.
Yeah, and you know, along the, we'll
Yeah, I think
listen with our institutional hats on as well as our individual hats. So.
Yeah, I
Right.
think that Rayner's idea of breaking into small groups would be good too, and then coming back as a whole. He mentioned that in the chat.
Mhm. We might do some of that. This is you know, kind of, it's partly discussion, but it's also lecture. So I think that's why we kept everyone in the same room with Reverend and the feedback open in the chat. But we're certainly attentive to where breakout groups might make sense.
Right, and also, we're still rolling this out in terms of continuing conversations during the week and things like that. So that may be another alternative as well.
Yeah, like it's not, this is gonna be over at the end of February. There
Right.
will be a follow-up process, so yeah.
And you'll be sending out a bibliography of Reverend Livingston's.
Yeah, putting it right on the,
Yeah,
right.
so much stuff that I always tell him, you keep me writing
He
and
keeps me
making a list
reading,
of
I'm
things
telling
I
you.
want to read, you know.
Right. And he's still talking about Una Judge, you know, that's his
Oh,
lady,
we
George
did that.
Washington
We did
slave,
that in
I'm
the
telling
book
you.
group.
I didn't
Yeah.
even know about her until then.
Oh yeah, we
Um,
did that in the book group. It was called Never Caught.
yeah, I
That's
read it. I
the book.
read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't put it down. Yeah, I read it. Yeah. So Carol and Pam and Charlene, you're on the what is the committee called? Adult Continuing Education, Adult Christian Education Commission. Is there anything we need to begin looking at for oh, what's his name? Dorian. Right. He usually pulls in a pretty big group also. And I think his topic will be a hot topic for us. And given his background in Afghan history, religious and political and social movements, African American, I think he's going to be just really amazing to help us pull this together. And for those who may not know him, he is the quintessential national scholar on Fosdick. So that's exciting. So look forward to hearing him on the 23rd. And then there's still a lot of excitement coming out of the president's office in terms of them participating. And so that's also very exciting, and also a very historic movement, a moment, not only at Riverside, but just in New York City and probably almost anywhere where we have this many scholars from very different backgrounds. And that's what's really important to know. We have a research institution, which is Auburn. Then we have NYTS, which is both in terms of degree and certificate, and well known for its certificate programs, which I used to teach there, are just a phenomenal urban ministry program at the certificate level. Then we have Union Theological Seminary, which started a certificate program recently, but they're also, their co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign is right there. In the person of Liz Theo Harris. So once, even moving beyond where we are now, we can start building coalitions of around these leaders in terms of helping us to locally begin to get more massaged about what we need to know about some of the issues that we want to coalesce around. Or groups of people in the church that want to coalesce around certain subjects. And then we also have, did I do all 4 institutions? I think I did.
Jewish,
JTS. And one of the things that we've often heard, and Carol and I are meeting with Chancellor Schwartz on Wednesday, I think it is, Wednesday or Thursday, the 13th, whenever the 13th is when we talk about freedom, that comes pretty much out of Hebrew scripture, and how we have appropriated so much of that. The Exodus story, the Joshua story, so many stories, the Amos story, the Joel story, those freedom movements and all. And to have someone talk about that, I think, and relation, and then also Jewish, the Holocaust, and having going through racism within their own ranks historically. So there's a good conversation that's going to come out around that, and I'm really excited about how we can get more information on how we biblically have been appropriating scripture and how potent that can be in terms of where it goes to the next level as well. So some really good stuff around there. I think it's going to be great coming from them. So we'll see. So I'm excited. I'm exhausted, but this is good.
Just one thing not to forget is that first time ever together on one stage.
Yeah.
President's discussion will be moderated by the Episcopal Divinity School Dean, Kelly Douglas, who has a high profile and has spoken so helpfully on reparations.
Yeah, she's done a lot of work on. I was reading. I had to take her piece out of my little presentation this afternoon, because I didn't want to make it longer than the 4.5 minutes or whatever. But just really good stuff, and also looking at what the faith and religious communities can do in terms of not just looking back, but how do you create the future? And that future has to be created out of the context of grace and justice that God has called us to. Just a beautiful article on that. And she's just good at what she does also. That's the other thing. She's just good at what she does. So looking forward to that. And then we have our own brilliant minds, archives, and just 2 brilliant people there, as well as Jim Keith doing the media. And just an FYI, I'm in touch with Raphael Warnick's communication person in Georgia. And she wrote Carol and I to say, this month we can be in touch with her about what are some of the things they're doing around voting rights and some of the other issues that can help inform where we are today. So that was really nice.
He's a Union Seminary graduate.
Yeah. Yeah, so much, just so much. We have a wealth of knowledge here, but we got to build coalitions. We've got to build coalitions, and I see the importance of that now. Okay.
Now, I haven't been able to keep up with you and Carol, especially, but exactly, as we prepare for next week, is there
week after next?
Week after next. Is there any tasks that have needs right now? Because you guys have run with this in a way that's incredible, but what else is where does it help to have someone with my skill set on board?
One of the things, well, 2 things. One is helping to create an evaluation form. That's not that you enjoy yourself, one that really gets at where people also want to go, have that piece as a part of the evaluation form. That would be one. And the other one, and Pam, you're good at this, and Carol is, brilliant at this as well. How do we begin to process categories of of interest that people have. Voting rights for one. The redistricting, which is a biggie for me. That would be one. But also looking at education and racism in New York City. I mean, I'm pretty local about this right now, to be honest with you. That would be another, John is interested in something like that. But many times, in order to have, as they say, street creds, you got to begin in your own neighborhood as well. In addition to some of the other things we need to do. But if we can say we're doing this home, I want to guard against being called the outside agitators when they're saying, well, you ain't doing nothing at home, big deal. But how do we begin to do that and to be that that powerhouse that coalesces with other churches in the community to get some of these things done? It may be a church that's going to do voting rights. That could be a possibility. It may be someone else that's going to do healthcare. That's a possibility. And Wall Run at First Corinthians, I'm told they have an incredible health program now in the community that other churches are now beginning to model. So how do we begin to hear what we are saying in the chats and in the conversation, and begin to just look at what are the questions around certain kinds of issues or subjects or topics? I think that would be really great. We'll all be doing that. But if you can help pull something like that together, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
And I'm happy to work with you on the evaluation. But we just need someone to be doing that. Yeah. And I think, Carol, unless I'm wrong, outside of the I'm so tired, I can hardly think. Outside of the we've already got everything set up for the next several speakers. Not the big thing, but the task that we have to work toward would be the half hour responders or reflectors. And that, I think that's about the only thing that we might need to just look at.
Okay.
And can you see anything else, Carol?
That's one is, making sure we've got a cross section of responders programmatically each time. And Dr. Pam, you're on the list to introduce the presidents, and why not just go ahead and moderate the session? Then the Q&A.
Well, she wouldn't moderate that. Moderate.
Right.
Oh no, it's Kelly is moderating.
Yeah, right. She wouldn't moderate.
Yeah, that's right.
That.
Yeah. That's true.
We'll
Yeah. But kind of be in charge of the wraparound.
Right.
And I think it'd be great if we had different moderator taking care of the wraparound each session. So again, we put our diversity into the presentations. Who's doing Dorian?
Amanda.
Amanda Meisenheimer.
Yeah, Amanda. She knows him. She's read his works, and she's a good facilitator. She knows how to do that. She hears very well as well. The only thing I would do for the presidents, Pam, would be to introduce you, only because they don't know who I am yet. And that would be the only thing that I would do, to welcome them in that sense. And then you can take it from there. If there's anything you need to know about them, if you don't have time to look it up in terms of their schools, just give me a holler.
I think the biographies and the kind of the highlights.
Right.
I believe I looked at all of them, but I'm going to look at them again this week so that it's fresher in my mind.
Right. Okay. That'd be great. Yeah. And that's it. I think you said that King is going to do archives. Is that right? Carol?
No, I'm sorry.
Charles King.
Oh, Yeah, we had him
Yeah, I
at,
think it was, so he was,
Yeah.
yeah, uh-huh.
yeah, let me
Um,
circle back to him on the specific. role.
Right, okay, right, Charles King. And I'm not sure who we had for Keat. I just have to look at my notes. I'm not sure about
Yeah,
that.
I'm forgetting to, yeah. Mhm.
Right. Okay. Well, I got another project for Michael, so.
You too.
You too. I've got another project for Michael. And we're just blessed that we have a scholar who can come out with that kind of content and just sort of melt us into a way of wanting to be together around issues that are so important to us. Really, really, really blessed to have him. Really blessed to have him.
He just laid it right out. I loved that.
I mean, but it was interesting because he talks about gentle rain. There was no gentle rain in his presentation at all. I mean, it was just pouring. I'm saying, oh, Michael, please, but and then I think we need to get someone to help manage the website for information coming in, like bibliographies and things like that. And I'm going to work with Robin about that. Because I think we should be able to do that on our end. And Charlene, you can help me not do it, but just navigate that. I'm not giving you any assignments. We do the tech stuff. But if you can help me navigate that, that would be helpful to me, right? Yeah. But I mean, I was humbled by the number of people that showed up today. And I have to say, and Carol, we know how excited we are. Council has showed out.
They're showing up.
I even saw Sam in there today. I mean, council, and I knew a few wouldn't be there because they said the notice had come out too late and they didn't know that it started today. But council has really showed out, and what a blessing to also hear them talk about. These are some of the things that they wanted to do because this conversation is also spiritual. And I thought that was very powerful, very, very powerful. So I can go in there, just shed a tear if something comes out of my eye and just say, thank God. It was just a beautiful day, just a beautiful day. So Carol, I like to take off for a couple of days, and then we do need to get something together to talk to Chancellor Schultz about. I'm pretty clear about what I would like to do, but how we see her really helping shape the larger conversation. And she was the only one coming from a different perspective as a Jewish scholar.
That'll be so exciting.
Yeah, so exciting. I'm so excited. Wow. Okay, this is your day, Carol, so you got to release us.
Bye.
Ready to be released. Yeah.
To love and serve God.
Thanks, everybody. And Linda, thank you so much, because I'm so glad that I would say at least that the Tower League is represented. And that's very important for us. Very important for us.
Okay. Welcome.
Fantastic.
Okay. Fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm elated. I feel blessed. Really feel blessed. Okay. So let me know if anybody needs anything.